Check this out. This is a flower in the game The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, and if I dump some water on it, now it's gonna die. The reason it's gonna die is because the only water on this whole island that's available to water this plant is from the ocean. In fact, pretty much all the water in this game is from the ocean. The thing about ocean water is that it's salty, like really, really salty. So salty that if you drink it, it doesn't even hydrate you, and it tastes terrible. Check this out. Drinking this water is not actually going to hydrate me, and if I only drank this salt water from now on, I would be dead in less than a week. So, how are all these people alive? Because the island that they live on, it's called Windfall Island, doesn't have any water on it. There are no rivers, there are no ponds, there's no water in the buildings, there's not even water in the coffee shop. How can you make coffee without water? You can't. Which means the people here must be getting drinkable water from somewhere else, and what we're going to figure out today is where and how. And also we're going to calculate how long it would take 50 garden hoses running on full blast to fill up an entire ocean, but don't worry about why we need to know that. We'll get into it later. The way we're going to handle this is by looking at all of Wind Waker's 49 different islands, and the only tool we're going to need for that is this. These are actually underpants that I'm using to transition into a sponsored segment. I'm sorry for fooling you, but it is kind of my job, so you know. I'm sure you can probably guess, but this video is sponsored by one of my favorite brand partners, MeUndies. Do you know why I like MeUndies? Because they're good. If you control F on any of the videos I've made where MeUndies is a sponsor, you can actually find organic comments that talk about how good MeUndies are, which I feel like is as good of an endorsement as I can possibly give. In fact, let's just spend this whole ad segment reading comments I've gotten from you guys about MeUndies. All right, this one's from Breach4135. Corporate shill here, MeUndies are great. I got a bad batch one time and they replaced them for free and even gave me a free pair. That person did a better job of promoting them than I usually do. Here's one from His Coconut Gun. It says, MeUndies are very comfortable. Fitting promo for a video about phallic objects. That was on the video about Starfield, so I guess that makes sense. All right, and then I got one more here. This is from Zalantra. The sudden MeUndies plug took 10 years off my life expectancy. Rest in peace. All right, here's the part that I have to read verbatim. Slide into game-changing comfort with MeUndies. Support the show by going to MeUndies.com/AnyAustin and using my code AnyAustin to get 20% off your first order plus free shipping. I like that they put support the show in that one. That's cute of them. Support my show. Anyway, back to talking about video game water. Okay, so the world of Wind Waker is divided up into a 7x7 grid, and each square on that grid has one island on it. Our goal here is to look at every single one of these islands and figure out which ones have water on them and which ones don't. A lot of the islands are pretty barren, like this one here, but some of them have entire villages on them, like Windfall Island, and that's where I want to start. The two villages on the map, aside from Windfall Island, are Dragon Roost Island in section F2 and Outset Island in section B7. Let's look at Dragon Roost Island first. Just like Windfall Island, there is no water-related infrastructure here, so no sinks or no bathtubs, nothing like that. But if you go out this door, you do find a little pond in the middle of the island, which is a source of water that isn't necessarily connected to the ocean, so it could count as fresh drinking water. Check mark for Dragon Roost Island. Next, we'll take a look at Outset Island, which is the very first place you go in the game. Outset Island is by far the most sensibly designed town in the game, to the point that I'm pretty sure it's literally the only place that actually provides houses for the people who live there. Outset Island, like Dragon Roost Island, also has a source of water. It's right here. I think this is a well of some kind. It might just be like a tub, but I'm going to say it's a well because it's you can see it kind of burbling up and moving in there. Now, what's interesting about this is that it means of the 3 towns in the game, 2 of them do have water sources, but the biggest one doesn't. So is this just a developmental oversight, or is there something else going on? It's too early to say, but let's look at the other 46 islands in the game and see if any of them have water on it. This is not going to take as long as it sounds like it is. Most of them, that is 37 of the 49 islands in the game, have absolutely no water on them at all. A lot of them are just rocks. Some of them have like plants or structures on them, but none of them have water. If you're quick with arithmetic, you'll know that that means there are 12 islands that do have water. Now, 2 of those 12 are Dragon Roost and Outset, which we've already talked about, but that still leaves 10 other islands in the game that have some kind of water source on them. So what have we got? 5 of those islands have what are called fairy fountains on them, and all 5 of those fairy fountains have a little pond that a fairy comes out of to give you special powers. I always kind of thought of these more like mystical spaces with water that maybe wasn't technically normal water, and I think the fact that the water in the fairy fountains is a different color than the water of the ocean kind of supports that idea. So I'm not sure they're going to be totally relevant to what we're talking about, but I figured they were worth mentioning. Aside from the fairy fountains, there's also this place, the Tower of the Gods in section E4. Now, the Tower of the Gods has a portal that takes you under the ocean, and down there is this, honestly, don't worry about it. Point is, there's these fountains with some water coming out of them. I don't know if this is really like hydrologically relevant, because I think it might also just be magic, but you know, sure. It is technically water, so we can put a little water droplet there as well. And then in square E6, you've got an island with an ice dungeon on it. Once again, I don't really know how to explain this one other than to say that it's probably just magic, because I'm pretty sure this has to be completely hydrologically impossible. Like, it's literally snowing inside of this cave. But you know, hey, there is water technically, so check for that. Now, with all of those out of the way, that leaves 3 islands remaining that have water on them, and these 3 islands are really where we're going to learn a thing or two about what's going on in Wind Waker. So the first one of these 3 remaining islands is the private oasis, which is a lovely little vacation spot in square E5. It features a full-blown relaxation pond, a waterfall, and if you follow that waterfall up to its source, which isn't very far, but we did it, you'll find this, an infinitely spawning water spot just coming out of the ground here. This is the closest thing that we can find to a source of water in the game, which is hilarious because Wind Waker, I have to imagine, is the Zelda game with by far the most amount of water, but I guess it has the least amount of water sources. In any case, so this is on the private oasis. The second of these 3 islands is called Diamond Step Island in square A6, and it has something very similar. It has a little spot of spawning water, there's a waterfall, and then a little pond that everything ends up in. Now, in some ways, spots like this seem very video gamey, right? It's just water spawning infinitely out of a spot in the ground, creating a whole stream. Seems very unrealistic. But, of course, as we've learned, the Earth, our beautiful home, is full of surprises. And it turns out that this is not only realistic, it can actually be even more dramatic in real life than here in the video game. Take this spot in Missouri, USA, called Big Spring. This is one of the largest springs in North America. It dumps hundreds of gallons of water per second onto the surface of the Earth, and it's, you can see, it's literally just coming out of the ground, and it never stops, ever, period. It doesn't freeze, it doesn't dry up. It's an infinitely spawning water glitch, which is kind of impossible for my tiny brain to fully comprehend, but thankfully we have these people called scientists who go in and they figure out how this stuff works, and then we have these other people called YouTubers who poorly communicate that information to the masses while getting all the social credit. So that's what I'm going to do right now. This is a picture from a paper that I found called Hydrogeology of the Paleozoic Bedrock in Southeastern Minnesota. Shout out to my friends at the University of Minnesota. And we're going to use this picture to explain how something like this is possible. So, the way that springs like Big Spring work is that water seeps into the ground and finds its way into these big underground chambers called aquifers. Now, aquifers aren't literally just giant chambers. Technically, it's usually like porous rock or some kind of sediment, but it'll be easier for us to visualize if we just think of it like a big cave full of water. So water goes into this big underground cave, and then let's say there's a crack in the rock here, and since this aquifer is a slightly higher elevation than where the crack ended up, all of that water pressure, as it squeezes down, is just going to squeeze the water through that hole in the rock and squeeze it out onto the surface, which creates a spring. Assuming that the aquifer is large enough, it might actually get refilled as fast or faster than it can drain, you know, with rain and stuff like that, meaning that the infinitely spawning water glitch will never end. And that's exactly what's happening at Big Spring. It's just all of this water from the surrounding area squirting out of this little hole. There are other ways for a spring to form that don't involve having an aquifer at a higher elevation than the outlet point, but the fundamental idea is the same in every case. If you have water that's under pressure and you poke a hole in whatever's holding the water, that water is going to flow out of the hole, creating a spring. That's actually exactly what happens when you turn on your kitchen faucet, right? You know, there's the water in there is under pressure, it's being pushed out. So when you turn the faucet on, it makes a little hole and then the water just squirts out of the hole, which means in a way you have a spring right in your house. We truly are surrounded by magic. Unironically though. Now the cool thing about springs like this is that the water flowing out of them is always fresh water. And as always, when I say always, I mean usually, but it's often enough that it's fair to assume that the water in Wind Waker here is fresh. So both of these islands would be great sources of fresh water for the inhabitants of Wind Waker. But these islands aren't where the inhabitants of Wind Waker are actually getting their water, at least according to me. Let me show you one more thing. This last island on our list, the final place with non-ocean water that I could find in the entire game, is called the Forest Haven. And in some ways, it's very similar to the other two islands we just looked at. You have an underground spring pumping water into a pond that flows into a river and then out into a lake. Only in this case, that lake is actually the ocean. This right here is where I was standing a few days ago when I suddenly realized that I was totally wrong about where the water in Wind Waker was coming from. I spent an entire week scouring the world of this game, searching for any tiny clues of water across all the little islands, trying to figure out where all the NPCs were getting their water to drink, when in reality, the answer was right in front of us the whole time. Look right here. Do you see this root, this big tree root here? Where is that root going? Yeah, it's going into the ocean. This is really interesting because, like we said back at the start of our video, plants really don't like growing in saltwater, especially trees. In fact, the only trees in real life that can truly grow in saltwater are mangrove trees like you see in Florida, and this definitely is not a mangrove tree. So how is this giant tree so alive and vibrant? How are all the plants on this island so alive and vibrant? This one's so alive and vibrant that it's talking to me. There's only one explanation that I can think of, and it's a pretty radical one. This ocean isn't saltwater, it's freshwater. Think about it. How are all the plants on the islands growing? How are the people drinking water? How does Beetles stay on his boat 24/7, 365 days a year? It's because nobody has to worry about finding fresh water to drink. If they did, places like Diamond Step Island would be inhabited. People would have put houses around this pond in Dragon Roost Island. And this makes sense in the context of Wind Waker lore as well, because this ocean didn't form naturally. The world of Wind Waker was intentionally flooded by gods, and I feel like if I was God and somebody asked me nicely to flood the entire world, I probably wouldn't have really thought about adding salt to the water that I used. I probably would have just turned on the tap and sort of let it run until the whole world filled up. Kind of like this waterfall. In fact, this is probably getting too far into game theory territory, but what if this waterfall is literally the source of all the water in Wind Waker? What if this entire ocean came from here? What if this is God's kitchen sink and God just turned on the water and let it run? What if? How long would it take to fill up an entire Wind Waker ocean if this waterfall was literally the source of all the water in it? Let's do some math. According to this excellent comment on a Reddit post by Reddit user Evans, Wind Waker's ocean is probably roughly 6 kilometers wide and 6 kilometers long. Technically, there is more ocean outside of the map. There's at least a whole other game's worth. Shout out to Phantom Hourglass. But for this exercise, we're going to pretend that the map of Wind Waker is the entire ocean. So we've got a 6 by 6 kilometer map, which means the only other question is how deep is the ocean. This is a little harder to estimate. And really, the only good look we get at it is when you go to the underwater section of the Hyrule, the part of the map. And when you're down there, you can sort of look up and see the surface of the ocean. In order to get a good estimate, what I did is I practiced guessing the heights of cloud layers in real life above my head every day for 2 straight weeks. And then I checked my estimates against local airport weather data to figure out sort of my natural estimation deviation. I tended to guess low by about 20% of the height of the clouds, meaning that if I thought the clouds looked like they were about 2,000 feet up, they were actually closer to 2,500 feet up. When I look at the surface of the ocean in Wind Waker here, it looks to me like it's about 6,000 feet. Assuming I'm off by 20% as I normally was with the clouds, we can safely assume that the ocean in Wind Waker is roughly 7,200 feet deep. For simplicity, let's convert it to meters, and then we're going to round it to an even 2,000 meters, which is also equal to 2 kilometers. So we've got an ocean that's 6 kilometers wide, 6 kilometers long, and 2 kilometers deep, which gives it a volume of 72 cubic kilometers. Apparently, according to science, a single cubic meter of space can fit 264 gallons of water, which means that 72 cubic kilometers of space can fit over 19 trillion gallons of water. We'll subtract a trillion gallons just to account for, islands and underwater mountains and stuff, which gives us an ocean with a volume of 18 trillion gallons. Now that sounds like a lot, but for comparison, the Pacific Ocean in real life contains roughly 352 quintillion gallons of water, which is approximately 20 million times more than the ocean in Wind Waker. Holy cow. Earth, man. So let's say we wanted to fill up our tiny 18 trillion gallon ocean using only this waterfall. In my opinion, as a gaming professional, this waterfall looks like it's putting out about as much water as maybe like 50 standard garden hoses. It just looks right to me, okay? A standard garden hose is 5/8 of an inch in diameter, and on full blast, it can output a maximum of about 1,000 gallons per hour, which means if we have 50 standard garden hoses, we can output 50,000 gallons of water per hour. That's a lot of water, or you think it is. So how many hours would it take to fill up an 18 trillion gallon ocean at 50,000 gallons per hour? Anyone? Anyone have any guesses? Do you feel like you're taking your AP algebra test? The answer is 41,000 years. Well, that kind of puts a damper on our theory, doesn't it? Now, obviously, with video games, especially games like Zelda, which aren't really that concerned with making complex, internally consistent lore, there's a big grain of salt that you have to take everything with. So even if technically this single waterfall can't literally be the source of all the water in Wind Waker, and even if technically they probably didn't actually think about whether the ocean was saltwater or freshwater when they made the game, the fact that we can look at it with this kind of intentionality and uncover so many fascinating, unintentional details does bring the game to life in a way that I think is really immersive and enjoyable, which of course is what we do here. For example, did you know that the village with all the bird people on it doesn't have any food or beds for the inhabitants? There's nothing, no forks, no nothing. To me, that sort of implies that the bird people just eat and sleep as they fly around the world delivering letters. You know, maybe they just fish out of the ocean. But on the other hand, they do have a human being working in the post office here, so what does he eat? He can't just fly and fish. But if this guy can't eat, what does that do? You think, what do they feed him? Maybe he's more of a pet and a member of the community. Can you have a human being as a pet in the world of Wind Waker? Let's not get into that one. I'm Annie Austin. Thanks for watching.